Welcome. This talk will explain what the Muslim Atlantic is. But first, let me begin by acknowledging that I have produced this video in the colonial settler community of Waterloo, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. More importantly, I am against the settler colonial project of replacing indigenous communities on this land, which is part of a global, modern colonial project begun by Western Europeans over 5 centuries ago. Muslims living in the lands neighboring the Atlantic Ocean were among the first peoples to be disrupted by the emergence of the modern colonial European project. When responding to this disruption, many of these Muslims have drawn upon the distinct traditions of being, knowing, and behaving developed well before the modern colonial period. Indeed, Muslims living in Africa, Europe, and the Americas have been connected for centuries by a religious, cultural, and socio-political network. This network is what we call the Muslim Atlantic. The first Muslim to reach the Atlantic in 682 was the Arab general Uqba ibn Nafi'. Apparently, he would have liked to have spread Islam even further than the northern Moroccan coast he had reached, since he reportedly exclaimed, "Lord, if only the sea had not stopped me." Within a few decades, Islam expanded northwards into Europe and southwards across the Sahara. Many of the merchants and warriors who led this expansion were locals who adopted the religion of the newly arrived Arabs. Several rival Islamic currents competed in the Western Islamic world until, in the 11th century, a dominant regional tradition emerged. This tradition converged around 4 central currents: Sharifism, Maliki jurisprudence, Ash'ari theological doctrine, and Junaidi Sufism. Let's briefly discuss each of these currents. Sharifism refers to a profound respect for the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, blessings and peace be upon him, who are designated by the Arabic word sharif, which literally means noble. Unlike Shia traditions, Sunni Sharifism does not consider it mandatory for Muslims to be led politically by sharifs. However, many Sunnis do accept or prefer Sharifian rule. For example, Morocco is ruled by a Sunni Sharifian monarchy, which perpetuates a political tradition begun in 788 when the first independent Muslim dynasty in the Western Islamic world was founded by the Sharif Idriss I. His wedding to Kenza, the daughter of a powerful chief of the local Auraba tribe, symbolically marked the beginning of Morocco's mixed cultural heritage in which Arabic and indigenous Amazigh lineages constantly intersect. Maliki jurisprudence is one of the 4 major Sunni schools interpreting the divine law to determine which actions are mandatory, preferable, permissible, discouraged, or forbidden for Muslims. Ash'ari theological doctrine is one of the main Sunni schools of thought concerned with distinguishing orthodox from heterodox beliefs. Junaidi Sufism refers to a spiritual current, usually transmitted within the regulated contexts of orders, and known for its scrupulous concern for legal and doctrinal orthodoxy. It coexists throughout the Islamic world with other Sufi currents, which can be categorized as ecstatic and socially nonconformist. Sufism is concerned with the experiential knowledge of metaphysical realities. The inner states and external conduct of individuals who attain this knowledge are characterized by the Arabic word ihsan, which can be translated as beautiful excellence. Sufi saints, as well as sharifs, represent embodied models, perpetuating the prophetic example of beautiful excellence within the framework of normative law and doctrine. In the 8th century, Idriss was considered a spiritually blessed, Sharifian ruler whose power was both spiritual and temporal. But not all Sharifs are considered saints, nor are all saints Sharifs. Sharifs physically inherit the prophetic bloodline, whereas saints inherit the spiritual tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him. One could add that scholars inherit his formal teachings, warriors his courage, and continue indefinitely with other types of traditional inheritance. Understandably, people within whom converge multiple traditional currents are considered especially blessed. Two such people are the 12th century northern Moroccan Abderrahman ibn Mashish and his disciple Abul Hasan al-Shadhili, after whom a prominent Sufi order is named, the Shadhiliya. Both men were descendants of King Idriss. Through their heritage, education, and influence, they embodied the emerging convergence of Sharifism and the Maliki, Ash'ari, Junaidi combination. Although many people reject aspects of these four normative currents, they have been strong enough for all other currents within the Western Islamic tradition to evolve in relation to them for the last millennium. In the African lands connected to the Sahara Desert and the Atlantic Ocean, and in the European lands now called Spain and Portugal, a whole variety of traditions and customs flourished in the pre-colonial era, including ways of speaking, working, moving, eating, loving, singing, washing, and all the other aspects which comprise the rich tapestry of daily life. The entire region was united by commercial, intellectual, cultural, and spiritual networks, which were in turn connected to the broader Islamic world. For instance, King Mansa Musa of Mali in West Africa employed experts from far away, such as a Muslim architect from Spain, and he sent many students to study abroad. The king is remembered as one of the richest men in history, whose land was traversed by a trade route which connected an enormous variety of peoples, from Spain to China. Yet, although they were ruled by Muslims, these people included adherents to other religions, such as the Christians and Jews living in Andalusia, or Al-Andalus, which was the name of the lands now called Spain and Portugal, when they were ruled by Muslims for 8 centuries. To be frank, some of the manifestations of the good life, as it was understood in the Western Islamic world, were frankly scandalous from a normative Islamic viewpoint. For instance, Andalusian courts were famous for wine drinking, dancing girls, and erotic Arabic poetry. But these controversial aspects seem only to increase the awe and wonder Andalusian civilization has long inspired. In the 10th century, a Catholic nun from Saxony named Hurra described the Andalusian city of Cordoba as the ornament of the world. Contemporary scholar Maria Rosa Menocal borrows this expression as the title of a book in which she describes the city as an astonishing place with 900 baths and tens of thousands of shops, as well as hundreds or perhaps thousands of mosques. Menocal reminds us of the hundreds of thousands of books collected in over 70 libraries across the city. In contrast, during the same period, she writes that the largest library in Christian Europe probably held no more than 400 manuscripts. Andalusian civilization was known for its flourishing arts and sciences. Its great cities were famous for their public hospitals, streetlights, running water, exquisite gardens, and magnificent architecture. These accomplishments occurred under centuries of rule by people of African descent. There was no major break between the Muslim ways of life, which developed on the European and African sides of the Gibraltar Strait. I have conducted extensive fieldwork in cities on the European side, such as Granada, Malaga, and Gibraltar, as well as cities on the Moroccan side of the Gibraltar Strait, such as Tétouan, Tangiers, Chefchaouen, Rabat, and Fez. Throughout the region, I have detected an underlying aesthetic, a mood, even a taste. This experiential dimension is crucial to fully understand the disruptive impact the emergence of the modern colonial European project had on the Western Islamic traditions which eventually crossed the Atlantic into the Americas. To understand the Muslim Atlantic, we must have some sense of the Muslim Atlantic experience, and we must explore Muslim Atlantic perspectives on modernity. You see, perspective is important. From a Eurocentric perspective, modernity represents a period of geopolitical and economic expansion for the Christians living in the northwestern margins of the immense African Eurasian world. These people, now known as Western Europeans, gradually became the center of a global political, economic, and cultural system after 1492. The Muslim perspective is different. Modernity was imposed on Muslims as a foreign colonial project. Muslims gradually lost their status as the dominant community at the center of the African Eurasian world as they were forced into the periphery of the modern European colonial system. It's also important to recognize that the modern colonial European project was motivated by a deep historical rivalry with Muslims. European crusaders and merchants returning from Western Asia and North Africa had been reporting for centuries that the Muslim enemies were generally much more advanced in terms of science, technology, medicine, industry, and arts. Christians living in lands once ruled by the powerful Roman Empire were comparatively poor. For instance, literacy rates in Western Europe were considerably lower than in the lands ruled by Muslims. This led to a growing impression among European elites that they needed to exit this period of darkness, eventually labeled the Dark Ages, to better compete with Muslims and eventually defeat them. The anti-Muslim zeal of the Crusades fueled European dreams of modernity as a rebirth, indeed a renaissance, after a long period of perceived obscurity. Muslims living near the Atlantic Ocean learned centuries ago that the modern colonial project, born in Western Europe, represents an existential threat to their bodies, but also to their unique traditions of being, knowing, and behaving. To explore how this threat emerged in the Muslim Atlantic, I would like to invite you to look at two monumental statues. The first is a sculpture of Prince Henry the Navigator, which stands in the middle of a roundabout connecting the main districts of the city of Sabta, better known in the West by its Spanish name Ceuta. This strategically situated monument serves as a reminder of the city's crucial role in the early stages of Portuguese imperialism. Sabta sits on the African side of the Gibraltar Strait. From there, the European coast is visible only a few kilometers away. The city, which came under Spanish jurisdiction in 1580, remains one of the few African territories still under direct European rule today. Although the invasion of Sabta in 1415 under Henry's leadership is not widely remembered today, it was a major turning point in world history. It launched the African Crusade, during which the Portuguese explored the western coast of Africa and conquered several cities and ports. Their aim was to divert the trade of sub-Saharan gold, ivory, and enslaved captives from the inland caravan routes dominated by Muslims. More ambitiously, they were seeking a passage to India and other parts of Asia which would circumvent Muslim-ruled lands, such as the Malian Empire of the famed king Mansa Musa. Portugal initiated the modern Atlantic slave trade and the Western European age of exploration, conquest, and colonization. It's also important to point out that Sabta was an important trade hub, allowing the last Muslim dynasty in Spain to access goods coming from Africa and Asia. By conquering Sabta, the Portuguese cut off the critical supply route to the Muslim kingdom of Granada. Across the Gibraltar Strait and a bit further inland, the Spanish city of Granada sits in the beautiful foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Today, at the busy intersection connecting the old and new sections of downtown Granada, one can find the Plaza of Isabella the Catholic. It is named after the 15th century Castilian queen Isabella, whose great-uncle was none other than Henry the Navigator. In the middle of the plaza, there's an imposing monument, which features the second statue I wish to show you. It is a sculpture of Christopher Columbus kneeling before Isabella and presenting his plan to sail westwards across the Atlantic. Two dates are written on the pedestal: January 2nd and October 12th, 1492. The first date corresponds to the conquest of Granada by Catholic forces, and the second to the day Columbus first set foot on American soil. These two interconnected events gave birth to the modern colonial world system initially established by Spain and Portugal. The conquest of Granada by Queen Isabella I of Castile and her husband, King Ferdinand II of Aragon, was the culmination of a major crusade against the Muslims who had ruled over parts of Europe for nearly 8 centuries. After the fall of Granada, all Muslims and Jews who were not killed were eventually expulsed from Spain. The genocide was complete by the early 17th century. Another genocide, whose completion was led by Isabella and Ferdinand, occurred in the Canary Islands, in the Atlantic waters just off the African coast. The indigenous Guanches were exterminated by Catholic crusaders and conquistadors who saw them as inferior savages. Clearly, when Columbus was mandated by Isabella and Ferdinand to cross the Atlantic, he carried more than a bunch of sailors in his ships. He transported the seeds of genocide. The European encounter of indigenous Americans who had not developed such technologies as the wheel, iron, and gunpowder established an asymmetric power dynamic which would soon evolve into modern colonial racism. Europeans were profoundly transformed by the remarkable ease and speed with which they were able to conquer the American continent, exterminate most of its native inhabitants, and access its enormous resources. Rather than living as marginalized populations just outside the more prosperous lands ruled by Muslims, Christian European men became the center of a new world system within which they claimed complete sovereignty over all living beings. They increasingly imagined themselves as positioned above the cosmos, the world, rather than within it, somewhat like deities. But Christian theology could not allow for such explicit idolatry. Instead, racism arose as an ideological construct which categorized various peoples in a hierarchical order dominated by Western, European, Christian men, eventually to be categorized as white. Before the conquest of the Americas, the notion of race was first applied to humans rather than horses during the Spanish Inquisition launched by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1478 to rid the Catholic community of so-called impostors. I'm speaking of the notion of race using that term. For example, Catholics with certain physical characteristics, such as dark skin, were suspecting of having so-called impure Muslim or Jewish blood. This indicated that they might be secretly worshiping the wrong God. Converts were considered potential traitors to the cause of making Spain a pure Catholic nation. However, impure blood did not explicitly put into question a person's humanity at that stage. The notion of pure Christian blood only became fully racist in the modern sense after it was applied to indigenous Americans. After 1492, Muslims and Jews came to be viewed by Christian Europeans as subhuman rather than simply having the wrong religion. Race rapidly became the organizing factor of human identity in the early modern colonial world system, which expanded by partially or completely exterminating Muslims and Jews in Portugal and Spain, Guanches in the Canary Islands, diverse indigenous American nations, Africans during the transatlantic slave trade, European women accused of witchcraft, and European Roma, pejoratively known as gypsies. Genocidal racism is therefore a constitutive aspect of modernity. What I'm suggesting is that we think of modernity from the perspective of these peoples. Eurocentric analyses generally focus on the political and economic motivations of colonial and imperial projects. However, the focus widens if you think of Europeans arriving or coming at you rather than expanding outwards from inside Europe. If you are an Arawak in the Caribbean or a Mandingo in West Africa, European colonialism and imperialism represent more than a political and economic challenge. They are an existential threat to every aspect of your life, including how you eat, dress, love, think, and worship. From the beginning, Muslims fought back vigorously against this threat. For instance, one fascinating historical figure you might wish to learn more about is Sayyida al-Hurra, an Andalusian who became governor of the Moroccan city of Tétouan and eventually Queen of Morocco. She was known by her Spanish and Portuguese enemies as the Pirate Queen because of the intense naval war she led against them. She's one of many Andalusians exiled in North Africa who joined Muslim naval forces to attack European ships and shores and disrupt their colonial projects. Interestingly, several Christians captured and enslaved during these raids refused to return to Europe even after being ransomed, choosing instead to convert to Islam and continue living with Muslims. In Europe, these converts became known as renegades and ferocious pirates. Nevertheless, in the early modern colonial period, the southern and eastern Mediterranean, most of which was still ruled by Muslims, was progressively forced into a peripheral position in relation to Atlantic European powers. Conquests in America gave Western Europe a huge economic advantage against the Ottomans and other Muslim empires. This advantage eventually became a political and cultural advantage as well. Over time, secularism has gradually replaced Christianity as the hegemonic modern colonial discourse. However, this ideological shift has not undone the racial power dynamics of the world system. For Muslims, it means Europeans on both sides of the Atlantic have increasingly attacked Islam as backwards and uncivilized rather than a religious heresy. Different colonial ideology, similar results. Okay, at this point, I hope I have presented enough historical information for you to understand 3 important points about the Muslim Atlantic, which I hope you will remember after this talk. If you're taking notes, write these 3 points down. 1. A distinct Western Islamic tradition emerged in Northwest Africa and Southwest Europe between the 8th and 15th centuries. 2. The disruption and colonization of traditional Islam by European powers was a constitutive aspect of the modern colonial world system born in 1492. 3. The modern colonial project has long represented an existential threat to traditional ways of being, knowing, and behaving in the Muslim Atlantic. If you understand these 3 points, it should be easy to see why it is important to study and appreciate the lives and experiences of Muslims on both shores of the Atlantic. As Canadian students of the Muslim experience, we need to be aware that while Islamic traditions from Asia and to an extent Europe should not be neglected, African Islam has been the main historical source of Islam in North America. I encourage you to learn more about the people of the Muslim Atlantic and its connection to the overlapping Black Atlantic world examined 3 decades ago by British scholar Paul Gilroy. Did you know that the Moroccan Mustafa al-Azamouri was the first non-Indigenous person to travel the lands from Florida to Mexico? Did you know that the first colonial settler in Brooklyn, New York was a Muslim called Anthony Van Salee? Do you know about how West African Muslims reorganized their societies in response to the devastating transatlantic slave trade through a series of Islamic revolutions whose fighters occasionally ended up in the Americas? Why do Canadian history teachers in textbooks speak so much about the American and French revolutions, but so little, if at all, about the Sokoto Caliphate of Nigeria or the Haitian Revolution? North American students should know about the many slave revolts led by Muslims in the Americas over centuries, culminating in the Haitian Revolution. In 1804, Haiti became the first modern nation-state founded by former slaves. One of the leaders of this revolution was François Makandal, a West African Muslim warrior who killed thousands of slave owners and established a strategic vision to end white supremacy on this Caribbean island. Many of us know about Malcolm X, whose Muslim name was Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, but few people can situate his thought within the broader Black Atlantic and Muslim Atlantic intellectual traditions. Few people know about the Muslim scholars and activists in Canada and the United States who draw upon his work today, such as Dawud Walid from Michigan, or Yasin Dwyer, the Muslim chaplain at University of Toronto. Few people know the influence of African Islamic currents on white Muslim women, such as Tamara Gray from Minnesota, or Ingrid Matson, who was born in Kitchener, Ontario, and now teaches just down the road in London, Ontario. The list of prominent figures in the Muslim Atlantic is long, and I don't have enough time to explore this list in depth with you today. However, I hope this talk has piqued your curiosity and convince you that the Muslim Atlantic is a topic worth learning about. Thank you for your time. And salam.